Want to do better? Then it's time to change the story. Welcome to our show about new visions currently transforming the world through the confluence of art, tech, and innovation. And now your hosts, Michael Ashley and Neil Sahota.
All right, welcome to another episode of Changing the Story. I'm really jazzed for our guest today, Dr. Ernie Ward. Dr. Ward is an award-winning practicing veterinarian and speaker, television and YouTube personality, and podcaster who specializes in teaching veterinary health teams and pet owners how to lead more fulfilling, meaningful, and successful lives. The guiding principle for Dr. Ward's work is life enhancement. He is actively involved in developing veterinary and human medical technologies, diet and exercise research, longevity and disease prevention, and integral medical practices. Dr. Ward currently serves as the co-founder and Chief Veterinary Officer for Wild Earth Pets in Berkeley, California, and the Executive Director of Education from VerticalVet in Raleigh, North Carolina. Hey, coast to coast, thanks for joining us, Dr. Ward.
Oh, Neil and Michael, thank you so much for having me. It's just a great opportunity to talk about some pretty, out there topics, but that impact our daily lives right now.
Well, we definitely like out there topics, so that's great, Dr. Ward. As a visionary, what is the story that you want to bring to the world?
Yeah, I think that, like most people's stories, there's a lot of different branches, but the stalk, the trunk, the roots of my story have been how to make people's lives better. Now, obviously, I have focused on animal lives because I do believe they contribute to us in ways that extend the physical, right? We know that there are physical changes that happen when you pet a dog or stroke a cat, but we also know the emotional context there is so meaningful, and we've just emerged or beginning to emerge from this massive global pandemic, and we know that people that lived with dogs and cats and other companion animals actually had lower reported stress and anxiety. So, emotional, physical, all of these things enhance our lives. And now I'm starting to say, how can we enhance the planet? And we know that climate change is real. We know that our dependency on animal meats, factory farming, is just destroying our planet and contributing to climate change. And so really at this point, I'm trying to say, how do we preserve the future and make it better?
What set you down this path, Dr. Ward? I mean, what inspired you to make a difference?
I think it's a strong survival instinct. It's actually sort of confronting mortality at an early age. And really, I say that with all sincerity. Two major impactful events in my mind that sort of led me down this path. The first occurred when I was 7 years old. I grew up in a rural farming family in Southwest Georgia, and I had my first two real dogs. I was 7 years old, and I actually found these dogs, Taco and Missy. But yet we lived, again, adjacent to other farms, and Taco and Missy roamed, and one night the South Georgia sky was shattered by the unmistakable sound of a 12-gauge buckshot going off. Taco drags himself back home somehow and dies, in my arms. And so that was the first traumatic event that sort of said, wow, animals are impactful, and I dedicated my life at that moment to serving them. The second thing, quite frankly, was watching my father, who in his mid-40s had his chest cracked open, for coronary heart disease, right? So I had seen all my grandfathers, all my great-grandfathers, and now my father die or be diseased by, in this case, coronary heart disease from diet and smoking and alcohol. And I was like, wow, that's not how I want this story to end for me. And so it really validated, and I would say, once again, it sort of encouraged me to pursue even more of a vegan lifestyle. So, that survival instinct that we all have within us, Neil, I think should say that's the reservoir of strength for the future, right? Because if you want to survive today, if you want to live the best life today, that is what sets you up for living a better life tomorrow.
Absolutely. And so you were kind enough actually to participate in the second book that we're working on right now. And we had a great interview with you, and you were talking about some things that really blew my mind when it comes to clean meat. And so for people that are unfamiliar with this topic, could you please talk about what your work is and what you're doing right now?
Right. Yeah. And so again, the term clean meat is one of many that we sort of describe lab-grown meat. So these are meat molecules. They're chemically identical to regular meat from an animal. So if you killed a cow and you analyze that beef, these are have the exact same properties, at a molecular level. So it's indistinguishable in reality. And so all of these lab-grown cell-based meats, clean meats, whatever term we want to use. And honestly, we haven't really settled on the language, which is part of the challenge because, right now from a regulatory standpoint, we don't know what to call it. And until the USDA and FDA really provide clear guidance, we're all sort of struggling with the language. But getting back to that, what really led us to form Wild Earth in the end of 2017, and from my perspective, there were 5 of us originally. And from a veterinary perspective, it was, I'd lived my entire life sort of as a vegan and a vegetarian. And I felt like I was the good guy. I wasn't the one who was contributing to animal suffering or climate change, or I wasn't the bad guy, encouraging all types of, poor employment and slave labor, right? Off the coast of Indonesia. I mean, so you're going, I'm the good guy. And then Dr. Gregory Oken and his team at UCLA published a study that really changed the trajectory of my life as far as Wild Earth. And in it, he said, what's the contribution of pet food to greenhouse gas emissions, right? So how many billions of CO2 and other, toxic gases are being produced, while we make dog food and cat food. And he concluded that about 25 to 30% of all U.S. greenhouse gas emissions were directly attributed to pet food manufacturing in the U.S. And then he said, well, how much of all the meat are we feeding these dogs and cats? Because this is a terrific number. I mean, a quarter, a third. And he found that about 25% of all meat slaughtered in the U.S. is fed to dogs and cats. So suddenly now here I am saying I'm the good guy. I realize I'm not so good after all because my patients, the animals that I've dedicated my life to serving, they're a major part of a problem that I thought I was helping solve. So that's really what kicked off us looking for alternative proteins, saying how can we impact it on the pet space? Because let's be honest, Michael, we can't solve the climate change issue if we just attack human food, because that would mean 25 to 30% in the US alone, we're just completely ignoring. So if we're going to tackle climate change, we're going to have to do it en masse, in totality. We can't just say, well, we'll pick and choose, like we'll attack hot dogs, right? I mean, that's not going to be meaningful enough to move the needle. And this is cataclysmic that we're talking about. And again, I don't want to be one of those hyperbolic, presenters here or guests on your show, but this is really happening, and it's happening at such an accelerated pace. And I was talking with a friend of mine recently. We were saying, okay, how much time did we get a respite, a pause with the global shutdown, right? So like you probably have seen stories where like the emissions from China were dramatically reduced, right? And so you saw Africa, all these, major, industries were shut down. And the truth is it bought us maybe weeks. I mean, so the calculations, because on the other side of this, China has ramped up production. So, it's honestly one of those things where, hey, you got a little bit, but now we're taking it right back. And so I think that was the seminal thing for me, Michael, is saying, look, I am here to try to preserve the future for my children. I have 2 daughters, and I want to make sure that they have a future that's actually somewhat normal, right? That they don't, have to wait in galoshes every day to go to work,
Well, that really powerful is really important. I mean, when it comes to climate change, I think a lot of us think like it's such a huge problem. What can I do as one person about it? But I think if we all do small things, it adds up for sure. How did you decide to go down this path? I mean, it's a great idea, but it sounds like you got to do some work, got to convince some people to come on board. What was that journey like?
Yeah, and so you're absolutely right, Neil. It's great to have ideas, but the execution is always the sticky part. And so we got lucky. I'll be honest with you. The first thing, I think most good science actually has its origins in just serendipity. And so we were thinking about, okay, what could we use? And so we started looking at the traditional ways that people were making alternative proteins in pet food, and that plant proteins, right? So people were doing this, having great success. We were like, well, we'll just do that. But then Dr. Ron Shigeta, who is one of the early founders of the company, he was like, I think we need to be looking at fungal proteins. And I was kind of like, I had a cursory knowledge and experience with fungal proteins. And honestly, what I knew about them was that they were notoriously difficult to ferment, that the yields were low and inconsistent, and that the cost was prohibitive. And, so we had looked at this in pet food industry, 20 years prior, but it just didn't work out. So I'm like, I don't know, Ron. I mean, I recall, doing some work here and there on it, just didn't pan out. He's like, things have changed. And that's really the luck part, right? That we had somebody who was willing to push an idea, and then the timing, right? So you got to have luck and good timing. And so he was right. The scale of fermentation technologies had changed dramatically in 20 years. We had amazing, basically people doing biofuels. So people that were looking at all these different fermentation technologies were largely coming from the fuel industry, and they were making advances that, were kind of unheard of 20 years prior. And so suddenly now we could actually grow these proteins at scale, and cost had come down. Because remember, at the same time that we're working on this in late 17, early 18, Impossible Burger, Beyond Meat, all these companies are starting to pop. They're attracting investors, which led us to the third part that you have to have. You got to have a little luck, got to have the right timing, and then you got to have the resources. And so suddenly now investors were flooding into this space, these alternative proteins, future foods, and we were one of the few, especially at that time, pet food companies going, hey guys, don't forget us. This is tens of billions of dollars. People are spending $30-40 billion a year in the US on pet food. We think we can serve, a portion of that market. So that's all those things had to line up. And of course, we just had a great team right out of the gate, people that were really creative, people that were willing to take risks. It's kind of crazy, right? Because suddenly now we're selling, vegan dog food. And even though I don't use that term, it's more plant-based. But, the reality is, people are like, what? They're carnivores. Aren't they like wolves or something? And so you're having to overcome all of this inertia, which is why we wrote the book, The Clean Pet Food Revolution, because, we wanted to make sure that we exposed some of those myths and give them the current science.
Absolutely. And I think that, I know that people are very concerned about this issue. They're very concerned about climate change. They want to do their part. But at the same time, I think that there is a reluctance for people to get beyond the traditional notions of what meat is. There's a kind of ick factor. There is.
Yeah.
Even if we're talking about animals, other animals eating, not talking about humans eating meat, but even our dogs and our cats eating clean meat. How do you address that kind of concern that people have about let's just call it an ick factor around this?
Yeah. And Michael, that's actually the terminology we use in the book, because you're absolutely right. Your instincts are spot on. It is a different, in fact, so what I do was something I've been working on, maybe for the last 5 to 7 years, is something called ingredient bias. The ick factor is rooted in a bias, a cognitive bias, based on our cultural upbringing, societal acceptance. We say, okay, what? In our country, we don't eat dogs. But if you go to certain parts of Asia, a dog is like a chicken, right? You and I instantly had a moral repugnant feeling. We were like, oh my gosh, this is crazy. But yet, these ingredient biases are a construct that we have created to really satisfy availability. Quite frankly, the reason that we in the US prefer certain foods is because they were accessible, affordable. Okay. And so then you get a bias towards things that aren't. When you talk about mushrooms, a lot of people in the US are just like, they don't quite get it. It's something you put on pizza, right? And the reality is, mushrooms are one of nature's super healing foods. And throughout all of Asia, they are made into some spectacular dishes. So, my point is that ick factor is something that we have to transcend with science. Because when you look at ingredient bias, we look at ingredients as we say, well, meat is good. Meat makes you strong, but it's not the meat. It's not the cow. It's the amino acids. It's the constituents of the meat. It's the vitamins, the minerals, the fats, the carbohydrates, and other ingredients, right? So we tend to look at ingredients as like meat is good. And I tend to look at this as saying, well, what is in that meat? What are the amino acids that make it good? And then how can we replicate that? So we have to transcend with science. And in fact, in the book, I talk about this future nomenclature, like how currently ingredients are limiting, because it does, like if I say pea, instantly an image of the Jolly Green Giant is conjured up in many people that are listening to this podcast. And yet I don't see it that way. I'm looking at, well, what are the proteins? What about the carbohydrates? What vitamins and minerals are so we've got to really use that scientific knowledge. And then I think the final thing is, as we begin this evolution of food towards these different ways of thinking about it, the ick factor gets removed, because it all boils down to health. Because see, what I am trying to do is provide an environment both for myself, my family, and my pets that we give them the nutrients that they need to be as healthy as possible, to fight disease, so that I don't wind up like my father. I mean, I'm far older than my father now whenever he had his heart surgery. And so I'm saying what we have to do is say an ingredient is a nutrient vessel. That's all it is. So whether it's meat or chicken or fungi or peas, what we're doing is saying what is contained in that vessel, let's break it apart, and then that's how the body utilizes it. So I love your ick factor. It's just a simple bias. And I think that what's happening is the younger generation is starting to be much more open-minded. One of the fascinating things we talk about in the book about how this is happening all over the world, when you go to Asia, they are so receptive to this stuff because they already have a more adventurous palate. That's good and bad, but they are already very accepting of new things. So like in Singapore, people are all over these products, whereas perhaps in South Dakota, they're not so much. Nothing against South Dakota.
I 100% agree with you, but as humans, we're not exactly rational people. I mean, I wonder if science is enough, because I remember actually putting a post on LinkedIn one time about cultured meat grown from stem cells, and the visceral responses I got back was just kind of, I'll call it eye-opening for me at least, but people felt very strongly opinionated because it wasn't, natural.
Right.
I totally get the science part, but is there an emotional or, some irrational tug that we have to try and address as well?
Right. And that's why I say it's a cognitive bias. This ingredient bias is a cognitive derived construct that we have just said, hey, we put everything else outside of that box as bad or harmful or not natural. And, and it's fascinating because, over the past several years in my lectures, I will often start off with a joke, say, if you want to start a bar fight, ask somebody what they feed their dog, right? I mean, we've really gotten to this level of emotional attachment to food that is unhealthy because, you have to pry my cold dead fingers off my hamburger, right? I mean, and it will kill you. So it's sort of this, I get it, Neil, and I don't have an answer other than I'm going to try to out-science everything because that is the only truth. The source of truth for me and for most of your listeners, I would hope, is scientific evidence. And so when we're looking at ways to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, improve health and longevity, decrease disease incidence, it leads us straight into these future food topics.
Well, it sounds like you're definitely changing the story. I mean, that it's about the narrative, the story that you tell. And clearly there's been a narrative around even the kinds of meats that we eat, as you mentioned before, things that we're accustomed to in our culture. So let's imagine we're 10 years out, 15 years out. How do you imagine the world is different, assuming people get on to and begin to think the way that you think about the foods that we eat? What does that future look like?
Love that question, Michael. Number one, it's going to be one of resource scarcity because when we start to project 10 to 15 years out, climate change has already impacted, global agriculture in significant ways. And so what will happen is beef, even to a lesser extent, chicken and pork will be very expensive. And so you're going to start to see this elitism of meat, as I call it in the book, because, when we do look 15, 20 years in the future, steak will be very much a delicacy only for the elite. And I think that this is where actually trickle down will start to have the impact in mass. One of the things that we talk about in the book is are places like Southeast Asia and Africa the place where future foods will take hold first because of cost and accessibility, because you can grow these foods in fermentation vats in Africa where maybe you don't have access to arid soils. So, there's some very, very interesting things. But getting back to the original ick factor, Michael, that's where I think it's going to start to break hard one of two ways. Number one, there is as I call it, the vegan health halo. So a lot of people are realizing that plant-based diets are just better for human health. And we're starting to see some more evidence grow in dog studies for sure. Obviously, cats are completely separate, which, we'll have to table that for my next book. But we're making some interesting progress there with those amino acids. But having said that, the health halo will start to polarize the market further because I mentioned this elitism. So it's going to cost a lot more to have that steak or filet mignon or whatever it is, right? So that's going to attract one crowd, but yet then elitism in terms of health. And so there's going to be this strong cohort, primarily led by millennials and Gen Z, or whatever we're going to call them, who are going to say, you know what? I actually want to eat foods and drink things that make me feel good and energized and improve my cognitive performance. And I think that that's the polarization that's going to occur, right? It's going to be like, I can do this, I can wear this gold Rolex. I do not have a gold Rolex, but because, that shows I am powerful and successful or whatever, right? We want to have those obvious, those conspicuous consumption triggers and markers out there, those signals to the world, right, that we're successful. And then there's going to be this other cohort, hopefully like you guys and me, we're going to say, I get that, but actually I want to live a long, long time. And on top of that, I want every day to be filled with creativity and energy and vitality and the ability to do my job and interact with family and loved ones. So that's where it's going to break. And honestly, the future health breakthroughs are going to be rooted in future foods, because as I keep getting back to this nutrient vessel theory, that it's, again, forget your ingredient bias. We're going to be able to dial up on Michael's DNA. We're going to look at Neil's microbiome. We're going to look at all of the different data that we have on you. And we're going to say, you need exactly this much of this amino acid, this much of this vitamin, and this mineral, because right now you're fighting an infection that you didn't even know about. And I'm telling you, this dialed in precision nutrition is here in 20 years. It's just fascinating world.
I'd love to take this actually one step further, because I'm totally with you, Dr. Ward. And I really hope this is what unfolds, because I think us obviously being healthier, living longer, more cognitive ability will tap into new forms of imagination and creativity. Just aside from the food realm, what else do you think we could probably tap into then? I mean, obviously, I got climate change, but what other things might be able to actually accomplish as a benefit from doing all this?
Right. Well, I think, there's no better source of truth for this, and that's our dear friend for all of us, and that's the famous author, Steven Kotler. And so I've known Steven now for, 12, 15 years. He enjoyed just amazing. And if you haven't read his books, just please go Google Steven Kotler and read them all very quickly, because it's time. I mean, he was so far ahead of his time, 15 years ago, but now he's amazing. But when we look at what are the other areas, the first thing I will say is that artificial intelligence is going to make things better for every industry. And right now, people are so afraid, am I going to lose my job to AI? What AI is going to do, Neil, as you know better than anybody, you and Michael are experts in this area, it's going to actually enhance the work that you currently do. So we see this as only broadening opportunities. But having said that, AI allows us to take massive amounts of data on an individual or on a global scale and actually now make some sense of it. Because the problem with medicine, and again, I'm a veterinarian, so I'm looking at all these different data points on health for a dog or a cat or a horse or whatever, right? And the human doctor does the same thing. But it's overwhelming, Neil. It's just too much data. I can only take a thin slice of that data and make an assessment, okay? So if I'm looking at kidney failure in a cat, I'm focusing on the primary biomarkers for kidney disease. Whoopsie, I forgot brain. Whoopsie, didn't evaluate cardiac function, right? Muscles. I mean, so with AI, that's going to allow us to be better practitioners of health, because we're going to say, hey, don't forget all of this stuff. And so I'm super, super buoyant on that. The second thing is, I think that as we transfer away from factory farming and we stop the destruction of habitable and arable lands, that's going to open us up for even better opportunities for human existence. I think that, people always say, oh, well, here's the deal. We can just take the beef ranches in Brazil and replace it with pea farms. Is that what you want, Ernie? You want fermentation things? I'm saying, what's actually going to happen? We're going to build better communities on those lands, right? So we're going to take the cattle, replace them with fermentation vats, but they require very little space and resources. And we're going to be able to build better homes or apartment complexes with more resources for children to grow into beautiful intellects. So, I am super, and I will continue to be super bullish and optimistic. What frightens me the most, though, is, again, some of the political climates. We mentioned Brazil. We mentioned, of course, our country, is that they do tend to slow down progress. And right now, when it comes to these future foods, Neil, you and I have had this conversation before, and Michael as well, right now, we just don't have clarity from the FDA and the USDA. It's slowing down a lot of work in the Bay Area where we just don't know what to do. We don't know what next step to take, because if we take the wrong step, then suddenly we're deregulated. We come under new regulation and suddenly our product is no longer viable. So it's frightening from that perspective. The only thing that's going to hold us back really are our own self-imposed regulations and rules.
So speaking of earlier conversations, we were talking right before we started recording this, and you were talking about the future of space travel, especially when it comes to animals. And I think that's another interesting topic, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, sure. And Michael, just in the quickest sense, right now what's being explored is how do we get human beings to arrive after a long trek in deep space sane? Okay, I mean, think about it, right? Because unless we can put you in some type of cybernetic state, so where you're actually frozen, as you see in the movies, which is being worked on. The Russians are making some incredible advances there. But the reality is we're going to have to figure out a way to get you there whole. And so the isolation of space travel alone, much less the colonization experience, we know that we've got to figure out ways to have people feel fulfilled, okay? And I mentioned at the very beginning that animals are an important part of the emotional and physical well-being of human beings. And in fact, the precedent here is the way we evolved as humans, as hominids, because if you go back and you dial back 55,000 years ago, I mean, much of the major progress that we made was accompanied by dogs. I mean, so this is kind of hard baked into our existence. And I think if you suddenly say, we're going to put everybody in space and they no longer have contact with animals, this is where a lot of us are starting to say this could be problematic for behaviors, right? Because you can't just do all of this through a computer program. And look, I don't disagree. A lot of enrichment programs can be done virtually. But Neil, I don't think we can replace the experience, the interaction of physical presence. And so what we're looking at, there's really several different ways to figure this one out. Number one, can we breed a species of dog or cat or some kind of companion animal that is very, as we say, less resource intensive? So that means they require less proteins, amino acids, require less hydration, they produce less waste. I mean, so all those things. And so there's some very smart people that are beginning to ask that very question, right? So, I mean, this could be, I used to say, think of a miniature dog. Okay. So could that satisfy that relationship, in a way that a robot couldn't? I don't know. Having said that, I think that we're really going to have to explore it. The second thing is that, okay, let's just say you transfer us to Mars and we've got a Mars colony. Would we have pets or animals in space? The first thing I will say is there will never be a cow on Mars. So if you think you're going to feed each other on Mars by having a filet mignon, you're not, unless it was grown in a fermentation vat, okay? So then we start to say, okay, well, what about other animals? How would we introduce a potentially invasive species into another environment? I mean, there's a lot of questions that have to be answered, but I'm still going to sit back and go, okay, what is a human being? What makes us humans? And part of that is caring for animals and interacting with nature. And I just don't see how we replace that all virtually. I don't think that if I just had a plant in my cabin on my interstellar spaceship that I'm going to be a happy pilot. I think I'm going to need it more to be an astronaut. And I think part of that is going to be, that an animal. It's funny, I used to always make a joke early in days. It was like, A, why are there no pets on the Starship Enterprise? And B, why did Ridley have a cat in Alien? Okay, these are two very different versions of the future, but I think you can see clearly that in Alien, part of her survival, quite frankly, was to care for her cat, Ripley, right? She wanted to make sure that cat, that was the last thing she did before she shuts the shuttle to the escape pod to leave. And so I think that is a fundamental part of the human experience. So anyway, I've gone on too long about this, but you get the idea. I want dogs in space.
Well, was the dog the first thing in orbit? I think the Russians shot the dog.
They did. Yes, I've been to that.
We're the pioneers, right?
Yeah, it's so true. Now, that's obviously, what was great about that particular case was that dog was recovered. So this wasn't just a one-off to do, some horrible experiments on. That dog was celebrated in Russia.
Awesome. Well, this has been absolutely inspiring. I hope our audience is. If they would love to learn more about you, your work, how can they get in touch? How can they get involved?
Yeah, thanks, Neil. I think the easiest thing is drernieward.com, DRERNIEWARD.com. Of course, I'm all over social media at Dr. Ernie Ward. But, I think that more importantly, if you're interested in future, if you're interested in, how can we help our planet, live and survive and thrive over the next decade or 100 years, we're going to have to take account our pets as well. What are we feeding them? I'll leave you with this, Michael. The average American cat, going back to that Oaken study, is fed 30 pounds of fish a year. That's more than twice what the U.S. adult eats, right? This is simply unsustainable. We've got to get more creative. I don't want to give up my dogs and cats and companion animals, but I also don't want to damage the future. So how can I do that? We start with the food.
Absolutely.
Awesome.
Fantastic point. So thank you again, Dr. Ward. We really appreciate you being on our show.
Thank you.
Hey, if you like today's show, please remember to hit the like button and leave a comment.
If you've been enjoying the Changing the Story podcast series, please subscribe and share it with your friends.
Thank you.